Here's what I heard, word for word, on a Tuesday afternoon in June, standing outside my mother's kitchen with a bakery box balanced on one palm. She still thinks the money's for my treatment. Don't tell her different. As long as she feels guilty, she'll keep sending it. And then my mother's voice again, lighter now, pleased with itself. Don't worry, we'll trick her, like we always do. She just got that raise. She'll hand over the rest without even asking why. They were talking about me, in the third person, in my own family's kitchen, like I was an account to be managed. This is where every drama family story usually begins, not with a slammed door, but with a smile that isn't real. But before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about 14 pages of bank statements, a recording on my phone, a lobby full of my coworkers, or a courtroom in Houston where a judge said words I will remember for the rest of my life, I want you to understand who I was before that Tuesday. Because the woman who heard those words through a kitchen wall is not the same woman who walked back inside 5 minutes later, and it matters that you know the difference. My name is Serenity Vaughn. I'm 32 years old, and until this past spring, I believed the same thing my grandmother taught me at her kitchen table on Dowling Street. That family is the one debt you never stop paying, and you pay it gladly because that's what love costs. I don't believe that anymore. I want to tell you exactly how I stopped believing it, because I think some of you already know this feeling. The one where you're standing in a doorway holding something good in your hands, and you hear a voice on the other side of the wall that changes what good means for the rest of your life. I want you to sit with that a second, the way I had to sit with it, because I didn't move for almost a full minute. I just stood there on the back step, holding a box of red velvet cupcakes from a bakery on Emancipation Avenue, still warm from the paper bag, still smiling from the good news I'd driven over to share. But to understand how I ended up frozen on that back step, you have to go back to that same morning. That morning, I'd been promoted. Senior account manager, a 32% raise, the kind of number that makes your hands shake a little when you see it typed on an offer letter. I'd worked at the same logistics firm near Main Street in downtown Houston for 6 years. Steady, unglamorous work that pays a mortgage, or would have if I'd ever let myself keep one. I drove straight from my office to 3rd Ward, past the shotgun houses and the community garden on Live Oak, out to the brick house on Dowling Street where I grew up. I stopped at the bakery first, because that's what you do when you bring good news. That's just how my grandmother raised me, and it never once occurred to me not to. I parked behind my father's truck and came around to the kitchen door the way I always did, because in that house, front doors were for company, and back doors were for family. That's when I heard it. My mother's voice through the screen, low and pleased with itself, talking to my sister Skylar about a woman who'd just gotten a raise. The same 2 sentences you heard a moment ago. I didn't barge in. There's a version of this story where I throw the door open right then, cupcakes and all, and scream until my voice gives out. That's not what happened. Something in me went very still and very quiet instead, the way water gets right before it freezes. I looked down, and that's when I noticed the shoes. Skylar was leaning against the counter in a pair of red-soled heels I recognized instantly. She'd posted a photo of them on Instagram 3 weeks earlier, captioned that she'd borrowed them from a friend. $1,200, give or take. The same week I'd wired her $300 for what she'd called a car repair, an emergency, she'd said, sobbing a little over the phone. The kind of sob that used to work on me every single time. The math did itself before I even wanted it to. I backed off that step slow, cupcake box still balanced in one hand, and walked to my car like a woman in a dream. The kind where your legs move, but you can't feel the ground. I sat in the driver's seat of my Honda for 7 minutes. I know it was 7 minutes because I watched the clock on the dash the whole time, needing something to look at besides my own reflection in the rearview mirror. Then I did something I'd never done before in my life. I opened the voice memo app, hit record, and slid the phone into my blazer pocket. Screen dark, microphone open. I don't fully know what made me do it. Some instinct older than thought. The same instinct that makes you flinch before you consciously register the sound of breaking glass. I got out of the car, jingled my keys louder than I needed to, walked back up that same path past the crepe myrtle my grandmother planted the year I was born, and called out through the screen door, bright as a Sunday morning. "Hey, y'all, I'm home!" The kitchen went quiet for exactly as long as it takes to arrange a face into something warm. Then my mother appeared in the doorway, hands already reaching for the bakery box, delight painted on so quick and so practiced that if I hadn't heard what I'd just heard, I would never have known it wasn't real. "Serenity!" "What a surprise, baby," she said, and Skylar came around the corner smiling too, in those shoes, arms already open. My father called from the den without getting up. "There's my big girl." I hugged my sister. I let my mother take the cupcakes. I told them about the promotion, and I watched my mother's eyes do a small, quick calculation. The same look you'd give a price tag before deciding how impressed to act. Before we get into what happened over the next few days, the statements, the recording, 5 years of transfers I never once questioned, I want you to remember this moment. Me, standing in that kitchen, smiling, holding a lie in both hands like it was still a gift. Because that was the last day I ever smiled in that house, without knowing exactly what I was doing. I stayed for dinner that night, because that's what you do. My mother made smothered pork chops, the recipe with the paprika she swears came from her own mother, and for 2 hours I sat at that same oak table I'd eaten at my whole life, laughing at my father's jokes, letting Skylar go on about a wedding she was supposedly planning with the man none of us had met. Somewhere between the cornbread and the sweet tea, I mentioned I was finally thinking about a down payment on a house of my own, out in East End. Something with my name on the deed and nobody else's. My mother's hand went to her chest so fast you'd have thought I'd announced I was moving to another country. "Don't rush into that, baby," she said, breath suddenly shallow. "You know my blood pressure. Family comes first." My father nodded along, agreeing a half second after she said it, the way he always did. "No need to be in a hurry," he added, not quite looking at me. He rarely did. I said what I always said. "You're right, Mama. Health comes first." And I meant it kindly, because 5 years earlier I had turned down a transfer to New York, nearly double my salary, after she called sobbing that my father was having a heart attack. I drove 3 hours through a storm to reach the hospital. It was heartburn. I found that out 2 weeks later and never brought it up again. I noticed something else that night, small enough that I almost let it pass. Skylar's phone buzzed twice at the table, and both times she silenced it fast, face tight, before slipping it into her purse. And on the drive over, I'd passed her car in the driveway, with the windshield sticker I recognized. A payment overdue notice from a finance company. I didn't ask. I filed it away, the way you file away a lot of things in that house. Back in my studio apartment in Midtown Houston, 400 square feet, a mattress still on the floor because I'd never gotten around to buying a frame, I didn't go to sleep. I opened my banking app instead, and then every statement I could pull, going back as far as the records allowed. 2.5 hours later, I had a number. $118,400. 5 years and 8 months of money I had knowingly, willingly sent. There was the $28,000 I'd wired after a bad storm when my mother called crying that they'd lose the house. Money that had been sitting in an account earmarked for my own first home. I slept on that studio floor for 2 more years after that call and never once let myself resent it, because that's not what good daughters do. There was a charge labeled emergency, Micah Medical, $4,500 from the spring before. My mother had said my father needed blood pressure medication he couldn't afford. I went digging through an old cloud folder I hadn't opened in years, the kind that backs up automatically without you asking. And there it was, a voice memo, recorded by accident the day I helped clean out their hallway closet, my phone forgotten on a shelf. My mother's voice, talking to Skylar in another room. "Just tell him to say it's for his blood pressure. She'll send it right away." That $4,500 had become a plane ticket, their first trip to Miami. I copied the file and labeled it, plainly, Evidence 01. Then I found something that wasn't in the $118,400 at all, a separate wound entirely. $9,200 moved out of an old savings account of mine back in 2021, back when my mother still had the password, into an account she'd labeled in her own handwriting on the paperwork, Family Emergency Fund. This wasn't money I'd sent. This was money quietly taken. The file attached to it was named Serenity_Backup_Plan. That name did something to me the theft itself hadn't. A backup plan means there was a first plan. By the time I found the folder marked Backup Plan, I understood I wasn't in a family disagreement. I was in a drama family story, and I'd been cast as the mark. Somewhere in an old file box at that house, I remembered, there was also a folder of my own paperwork. Tax returns, an old loan application I'd started and abandoned, a photocopy of my driver's license that I'd left there years ago for safekeeping, back when I still believed that house was the safest place I knew. I've had a long time to think about what made my mother capable of this, and I don't believe she ever saw herself as a thief. I think she was afraid of growing old without leverage, afraid that once I stopped needing to be needed, I'd stop calling at all. Guilt was the only currency she trusted, because unlike love, it never expired on its own. That fear is exactly what was sitting underneath the smile in that kitchen, long before I ever knew to look for it. I didn't cry. I think you might expect me to, and maybe you would have. But by then, something in me had gone past crying into a colder, clearer kind of quiet. I opened a new bank account that night, one with my name on it and nobody else's, and moved every dollar I had, $267,000, more than I realized I'd managed to keep, out of every account they'd ever touched. I deleted Venmo. I deleted Cash App. I changed every security question to an answer none of them would ever guess. I called my realtor in East End and told her to put everything on hold. Then, at 11 at night, I emailed my boss, Andre Langford, and asked if the Seattle opening he'd mentioned back in the spring was still available. He wrote back within the hour. Same level, same raise. Paperwork could move inside the week if I wanted it. I stared at that email a long time before typing back one word. Yes. I lay awake after that, looking at the water stain on my ceiling I'd meant to ask the landlord about for 2 years, thinking about my ex-husband and the last thing he ever said before he left. You always put them first. There's nothing left for us. I'd told him he was being unfair. I told myself he was being unfair for 2 more years after the divorce was final. That night, for the first time, I let myself wonder if he'd simply been right. I didn't sleep much, but I woke up clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in years, and some small, stubborn part of me already knew my mother would call soon, with something bigger than a car repair. I just didn't know yet how far she'd go to get it. She cut off 5 people who raised her. Overnight, no warning, no goodbye, before anyone had even been confronted with proof. Justified or too far? Drop one word in the comments, justified or too far. And stick around, because what her mother does next might change your answer. The call came 2 mornings later, not the next day, because it took them that long to notice. It took them that long to try Cash App and find it gone, to try the old passwords and find them changed, to realize the daughter who never asked questions had suddenly stopped answering easy ones. Those 2 mornings were their own kind of test. I went to work both days like nothing had happened, sat through meetings, signed off on shipments, answered emails in a voice so normal it almost scared me. But at night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the folder of statements squared in front of me, running my thumb along the edge of the pages the way you'd touch a bruise to see if it still hurt. It always did. I kept waiting to feel triumphant, righteous, something with a clean name to it. Instead, I mostly felt tired and a little bit like a stranger in my own life. A woman who'd spent 32 years memorizing a set of rules that had just turned out to belong to somebody else's game entirely. By the time my mother called, her voice was doing something I'd heard only twice before in my life, a tremble so careful it had clearly been rehearsed. I could hear the television murmuring behind her, and somewhere further back, water running, the ordinary sounds of a house pretending nothing was wrong, laid underneath a voice performing exactly that. "Baby," she said. The doctor thinks it's stage 3. I need you here. My mother didn't fake that diagnosis because she was cruel by nature. She did it because for the first time in her life, guilt alone wasn't working, and panic makes people reach for whatever weapon is left in the drawer. Underneath the performance was a woman terrified of becoming ordinary, just a mother, with no crisis left to offer, and nothing urgent left to make her matter. Fear of irrelevance can make a person do things love never would. I want to be honest. Even knowing what I knew, some old, well-worn part of me still felt my stomach drop. 15 years of believing a voice like that is a hard habit to unlearn in one night, no matter how much evidence you're carrying in your bag. I hung up and sat very still in my apartment for a moment, phone warm in my palm, and I let myself feel it, the old reflex, the one that wanted to grab my keys and run, no questions, the way I always had. Then I thought of the voice memo folder on my laptop, the $4,500 that had become a plane ticket to Miami, the $9,200 moved into an account labeled in my mother's own handwriting. I thought of the words backup plan, and something in me steadied, the way a hand stops shaking once it finally has something solid to hold on to. I drove to Dowling Street with the folder of statements on the passenger seat, printed and clipped, 14 pages thick. The drive took 18 minutes, and I remember every one of them. The AC rattling faintly on the dash, the way the light came in low and gold through the windshield as I turned off Scott Street, the same crepe myrtle blooming pink and stubborn on the corner 2 blocks from the house, exactly as it had every June of my life. I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted to hear myself think. My mother was arranged in bed when I walked in, pale in a way that took me only a second to place. I recognized the shade of setting powder from her vanity, the same shade she used to dust along her cheekbones before church. The curtains were drawn halfway, letting in just enough gray afternoon light to look convincingly like a sick room, and not so much that anyone could examine her too closely. Skylar sat beside her, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, the box of them positioned a little too perfectly on the nightstand, as if it had been set there for the scene, rather than found there by accident. My father stood by the window, not quite looking at either of us, one hand resting on the sill like he needed something to hold on to that wasn't a person. "The surgery's $180,000, Skylar said, before I'd even set my bag down. Her voice cracked exactly where a rehearsed voice cracks, too neatly, too on cue. You're the only one who can help her." That's when I saw it. Skylar's phone, charging on the nightstand, lit up with a message from a number saved only as digits. "Where's the money? Don't think about running. We're coming in 48 hours. I thought of the repossession sticker on her car 2 nights before. Whatever this was, it hadn't started that morning. "I think it's time we all stopped pretending," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Nobody moved for a long 4 seconds. I could hear the television still playing faintly from the den, my father's ball game murmuring on without him, and somewhere outside a neighbor's dog barking twice and going quiet. My mother's hand, resting on the blanket, went very still, the particular stillness of someone recalculating a plan in real time. I laid the statements on the bed, right over the blanket pulled up to my mother's chin. $118,400, I said. Aunt Loretta's treatment that never happened, Skylar's wedding that never happened, Dad's back surgery, the cruise, all of it. My mother's hand found the papers, pushed them half off the bed. "That roof money was a gift, baby. Why are you dragging up old things?" Skylar's voice cracked in fast, defensive. "You always act like we owe you something. We raised you." I took out my phone and played the recording. The one from the closet, the one I'd found at 2 a.m. My mother's own voice filled that bedroom. "Just tell him to say it's for his blood pressure. She'll send it right away." My mother's face went the color of the powder she'd used to fake it. My father's hand tightened on the windowsill, knuckles going pale, but he still didn't turn around, and I understood, watching his back in that gray light, that his silence had never once been neutral. It had always been a kind of vote. I want to be honest about what was happening inside me in that bedroom. Part of me still wanted her to have an explanation, some small human reason I could forgive. That's the tug of war nobody tells you about. The part of you that still loves the person hurting you, arguing right up until the evidence closes the case. I didn't raise my voice because by then I understood something my younger self never could. That calm isn't the absence of pain. It's what's left standing after you stop needing them to admit it. I paid for that roof while I slept on a mattress on the floor for 2 years, I said, keeping my voice even. That's not a gift. That's theft with a smile on it. And now I have it on tape. Skylar broke first. It came out of her all at once, the way things do when a person's been holding them too tight for too long. She owed $215,000 to people who didn't send polite reminders. Her hands were shaking by then, not performing anymore. And for one strange second, I felt something closer to pity than anger, gone as quickly as it came. My mother tried one more time to summon tears, but there was nothing behind them now, and we all knew it. Then go to Memorial Hermann, I told her. I'll wait right here for the real test results. I stood and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I closed it softly because I didn't need noise to make my point. Sometimes quiet is louder. Every drama family reaches a moment where the performance can't hold anymore. This was ours. I stood on the porch for a moment before I reached my car, the evening air thick and warm the way it only gets in Houston in June. And I looked back once at the house on Dowling Street. The crepe myrtle, the kitchen window, the porch light my grandmother used to leave on for me, and felt, for the first time, like a visitor looking at someone else's childhood. By the time I got to my car, my phone was already lit up. 27 missed calls, dozens of texts stacking on top of each other. One message cut through the rest. It was from Xavier Langston, my closest friend since high school. The one person outside that house who'd known for years, without me ever quite saying it, exactly what my family cost me. Don't go home. Something bigger is happening. I sat in the driveway with the engine off, staring at those 5 words, and for the first time all day, I felt afraid. The 3 days between that message and the conference room were the quietest of my life, and not in a good way. I didn't go back to Dowling Street. I didn't answer when the calls came in, sometimes 4 in a row, my mother's name lighting up the screen like a warning light on a dashboard I'd finally learned to trust. I let my apartment go still around me. I packed slowly, methodically, folding sweaters I hadn't worn since a work trip to Chicago, wrapping the one picture frame I owned, my grandmother, unsmiling, on the porch on Dowling Street, taken before any of this, before I was even born, in a dish towel and tucking it into a suitcase like it might break. Xavier called every night at 9. We didn't always talk about my family. Sometimes we just stayed on the line while he cooked dinner 2 miles away, the sound of his knife against a cutting board more comforting than anything either of us said. You're allowed to just breathe for a minute, he told me on the second night. You don't have to solve the rest of it tonight. I remember thinking that was the first permission anyone in my life had ever given me to simply stop. 3 days later, I was in a conference room near Main Street, finalizing transfer paperwork for Seattle, when an assistant knocked, pale-faced. Serenity, there's a woman downstairs saying she's your mother. She's live streaming. The elevator ride down took 11 floors and felt longer than the drive from Dowling Street. I watched the numbers count down. 9, 8, 7. And I remember pressing my thumbnail hard into the pad of my index finger, an old habit from childhood, just to feel something besides the roaring in my ears. The doors opened onto marble I'd walked across 1,000 times without noticing it, and for the first time, I noticed everything. The fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, the security desk, where a guard I recognized stood frozen, one hand still resting on the phone, unsure whether to call his supervisor or the police. A small crowd of my coworkers had gathered near the elevator bank, coffee cups forgotten in their hands, the particular stillness of people who don't know if what they're watching is real. By the time I reached the lobby, my mother was already mid-performance, tears streaming, voice pitched to carry to the very back of that glass atrium. Skylar stood a few feet away, phone raised, the little red recording dot steady and unblinking, the way I imagine a gun sight must look to the person standing in front of it. "My daughter got a big raise, and now she's abandoned her dying mother," my mother cried into the camera, and I watched her actually adjust her angle toward the window, the way she used to check her reflection in the toaster before company came over. Some part of me, even then, noted it the way you'd note a magic trick you already knew the mechanics of. Security moved in fast, guiding her toward the doors, but she planted her feet, and for one long second, her eyes found mine across that lobby. Not pleading, not even really pretending anymore. Just calculating, the way she always had, whether this particular audience would tip the scale. I felt my heels stop clicking against the marble. I felt my own pulse in my throat. A co-worker from accounting, someone I'd shared 100 elevator rides with and maybe 6 real conversations, put a hand lightly on my arm without a word. Not stopping me, just letting me know she was there. That small, wordless gesture did something to me that all my mother's shouting couldn't. Skylar swung her phone toward my face, close enough that I could see her hand shaking, just slightly, just enough that I understood, even then, even furious, that some of what was happening to her wasn't entirely her own choosing. "Say it again for the people! Tell them how you left your cancer mama to die!" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I looked straight into that lens and said the only thing I had left to say. I spent 15 years putting this family first. Today, I choose myself. For a moment, nobody in that lobby moved. Then the security doors sighed open, and the sound of Houston traffic rushed in, and my mother's voice rose one last register before the glass swallowed it whole. The stream had over 1,000 people watching by the time security got them out the door. HR pulled me into a private office within the hour, blinds drawn, a box of tissues pushed toward me that I didn't touch. Andre came in himself, closed the door, and sat across from me instead of behind his desk, which was its own small kindness. I laid it all out, the statements, the recording, the debt collector threats. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said only, "You don't owe this company an explanation for surviving your own life, Serenity. Let's get you to Seattle." My company didn't hesitate. They moved my transfer up. 10 days, they told me, and they'd cover relocation. I thought that would be the worst of it. I was wrong. Walking out of the building that evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Xavier. "Don't go home. They just posted the house for sale on Facebook. $380,000. Caption says you abandoned the family, and they have to sell to cover Skylar's debts. 300 shares in 2 hours. They've hired a lawyer. They're filing for elder support payments and emotional damages. Good news. I know somebody. A lawyer friend out in Seattle who owes me a favor. Might be worth a call before this goes further." A second message followed, a screenshot. My mother had posted an old photograph, the two of us, me maybe 8 years old, arms around her neck, captioned, "Serenity always promised she'd take care of us." I understood then that this had stopped being about money entirely. They didn't just want my wallet anymore. They wanted me humiliated into coming back, on my knees, in front of everyone who'd ever known us. I went back to my studio apartment one last time instead of the airport straight away. I stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the water stain on the ceiling I'd meant to ask the landlord about for 2 years, at the mattress still on the floor, at the one stubborn basil plant on the windowsill I'd somehow kept alive through 2 winters. I didn't take much. I left the mattress. I took the framed photo of my grandmother, the folder of evidence, and 2 suitcases, and I locked the door behind me the way you'd close a book you already knew the ending of. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the airport with everything I had left. On the plane to Seattle, a message came in from a number I didn't recognize. A lawyer's office. "Ms. Vaughn, we will see you in court. Your parents are devastated." I turned my phone off and looked out the window at the clouds, wondering whether I'd ever really be free of that house on Dowling Street, or whether some part of me would always be standing on that back step, holding a box of cupcakes, waiting to be trusted with the truth. Hope Ellison met me at the gate in Seattle, standing near baggage claim with a paper cup of coffee in each hand, one of which she handed to me before I'd even said hello, as though she'd already decided, correctly, that this exchange needed a small kindness in it before it needed conversation. Outside, the air was cool and damp in a way Houston never allowed for, and I stood on the curb waiting for a rideshare, breathing in the smell of wet cedar and exhaust, thinking it was the first air I'd breathed in years that didn't carry a single trace of Dowling Street. I'd found her through a coworker's recommendation, a realtor who specialized in helping people relocate quickly, and within 9 days, she'd found me a 2-bedroom craftsman with a small backyard in the Central District. I signed the papers with a hand that barely shook anymore, though I noticed Hope noticed it. Her eyes flicked, just once, to my fingers on the pen, and then politely away. Standing in that empty living room afterward, keys in my palm, I cried for the first time in weeks. But they weren't the tears I was used to. They didn't hurt going down. That first night, I didn't buy a bed. I unrolled a sleeping bag in the middle of the empty living room floor, the same way I'd slept on a mattress on a floor for 2 years to pay off a roof that was never mine to fix. Except this floor didn't ache the same way. I lay there, listening to rain against a window that belonged to no one but me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the silence in a house didn't feel like something I had to earn. The first thing I bought wasn't furniture. It was seed packets, tomatoes, collard greens, a little oregano, and I put them into the ground before I'd even bought a bed to sleep in. Xavier flew out 2 weeks later and handed me a flash drive before he'd even set his bag down. We'd known each other since we were 11, 2 kids from the same block on the edge of 3rd Ward who'd ridden the same bus to the same overcrowded middle school, and somewhere in 20 years of friendship, he'd become the only person who never once asked me to prove that what happened in that house was real. On the drive was the paperwork for that Family Emergency Fund from 2021, along with a scanned loan application from a Houston credit union, $50,000, my signature forged onto it, using the old folder of documents I'd left behind at that house years ago, back when I still thought of it as the safest place I knew. A loan officer had flagged the signature as suspicious and held the file. If I hadn't left when I did, that debt would have found me eventually, real and legally mine, whether I'd asked for it or not. I kept everything, Xavier told me quietly, setting his bag down at last, because I always had a feeling this day was coming. You're not losing your mind, Serenity, you're just finally free of it. He also mentioned the friend he'd texted about, a lawyer he'd known since college, out here in Seattle, who owed him one. Call her, he said, just in case. I did call her a few days later, sitting on the back steps of my new house with the phone against my ear and a cup of tea going cold beside me. Her name was Justice Hale, and something about the calm, exact way she talked made me trust her before she'd even finished her first sentence. Send me everything you have, she said. Every statement, every recording, every screenshot. Not because I think you'll need it, just because I'd rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it. It seemed at the time like the kind of cautious advice any good lawyer gives a client still shaking off a bad year. I spent an evening scanning documents into a shared folder and mostly forgot about it, the way you forget about a smoke detector you've just changed the batteries in, reassured but not really expecting it to matter. Over the months that followed, I built a small, quiet life. I joined a hiking group that met most Saturdays at Discovery Park, learning the names of trees I'd never had reason to know in Houston. Douglas fir, red cedar, big leaf maple, and something about learning a new landscape from the ground up felt like learning how to be a person again. I had coffee, slow and unhurried, with a man named Khalil at a shop on Rainier Avenue, the kind of place where the barista knew your order by the 3rd visit, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I laughed without calculating what it would cost me later. 6 months after I'd left, my phone rang with a Houston number. I didn't answer. A few minutes later, a text came through from Xavier. Skylar got arrested today for check fraud. Camille's crying on Facebook Live, asking for you. Don't watch it. I set the phone face down on the counter and walked outside instead, into a light Seattle rain, and watered my tomatoes. Picture that split for a second, the way I still do sometimes. In one city, a woman screaming into a phone camera, begging strangers for sympathy. In another, her daughter standing quiet in the rain, hands in the dirt, breathing steady for what felt like the first time in her life. That was the moment I understood I had actually gotten out, not just moved away, out. I told myself that evening that it was finally over. Some quiet, watchful part of me, the part that had learned the hard way never to trust a closed door in that family, wasn't so sure. It would be 4 more months before I found out it was right. A year after I left Houston, a wedding invitation arrived in my mailbox on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday, tucked between a seed catalog and an electric bill. I recognized the handwriting before I even turned it over. Skylar had always dotted her I's with small, deliberate circles, a habit from a middle school phase none of us ever let her forget. Skylar had married someone new, a fresh start meant to outrun old debts rather than face them. I stood at the end of my own driveway for a long moment, the paper cool and slightly damp from the morning air, and felt almost nothing at all, which surprised me more than grief would have. I didn't open the envelope. I wrote one line on the back and dropped it in the trash. I hope you learn to pay your own bills. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone but myself. Some things don't need an audience to count. Then, on an ordinary Monday morning, Hope called me, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Serenity, there's a legal envelope waiting for you." I remember the exact sound of my own front door as I opened it, the small catch it always made on the second try, and the flat gray light of a Seattle morning that made the courier's yellow envelope look almost cheerful against it. Inside was a notice from a Houston court. My parents had been granted a temporary emergency order, the kind a judge signs quickly, based only on the story in front of them, before the other side has had any chance to speak. It required me to pay $2,000 a month and barred me from leaving Washington State until a full hearing. They'd used that old photograph, me as a child with my arms around my mother's neck, as evidence of a lifelong bond of devotion. I hadn't even known the filing existed until it was already signed. I sat down on my own front steps, the same steps I'd sat on to call Justice Hale that first quiet week, and read the order twice through, my hands cold despite the coffee mug I was still holding. For a moment, I felt the ground go soft beneath me, the exact same feeling I'd had standing outside my mother's kitchen door over a year before. The floor of my life tilting without warning under a story someone else had written about me. But only for a moment. I called Justice Hale before I'd even finished reading it a third time. She picked up on the second ring, and when I read her the order line by line, she didn't sound surprised. She sounded almost pleased, in the clipped, focused way of someone watching a plan finally come together. "Serenity," she said, "you sent me everything the very first month you got here. I filed a countersuit, a protective order, and a federal fraud complaint 3 weeks ago. They just walked straight into the case you already built. That order they won was never going to survive a full hearing. It just bought them a little time. We're about to take it back." I sat with the phone against my ear a long moment after she finished, thinking about that evening a year earlier, scanning documents into a folder I'd mostly forgotten about, treating her advice like a smoke detector I didn't expect to ever need. I understood, finally, what she'd actually been building that whole time. Quietly, 3 states away, while I planted tomatoes and learned the names of trees. 2 weeks later, we appeared by video before that same Houston court. I sat at my own kitchen table in Seattle, laptop open, Justice Hale's calm voice coming through my headphones, while on the small rectangle of screen in the corner, I watched the Houston courtroom assemble itself. The flag in the corner, the dark wood of the bench, my mother in a blouse I recognized from a church function years before, her hands folded with a stillness that looked, even now, almost convincing. My lawyer laid it out in order. The recording of my mother instructing my sister to lie, the debt collector threats, the forged loan signature, the file named after a plan to drain me slowly over years, the live stream in my office lobby, the Facebook post blaming me for a house they'd chosen to sell. I watched my mother's face on that small screen as each piece landed. Watch the practiced stillness crack a little more with every sentence, the way ice does under weight before it finally gives. I didn't want them punished for the sake of punishment. What I wanted, more than anything, was for the story to stop being mine to carry alone, For someone with real authority to finally say out loud that what happened to me had a name. That's the quiet ache underneath most family betrayal, not just the loss itself, but the years spent as the only one who believed it was real. The judge looked at my mother and said, evenly, "This is not elder abandonment. This is systematic financial fraud spanning at least 6 years. And using your daughter's identity to secure a loan is a federal offense." Officers were already present, just outside the frame of the camera, and I watched them step into view the way you'd watch weather roll in on a distant hill, inevitable once you knew what you were looking at. My mother was taken into custody without incident. Skylar's bail was revoked, and for 1 second, just before the screen cut away from her, I saw something in her face that wasn't performance at all, something closer to relief, as if some part of her had been waiting years for someone else to finally stop the game. My father sat silent throughout, staring at the screen like he still didn't fully understand how we'd arrived here. And watching him, I found I felt less anger than I expected. He had never been the architect of any of it. He had simply never once chosen to stop it. And by the end, I understood those were not the same thing, but they weren't so different either. I looked into that camera one last time and said the only thing left to say. "I heard you in that kitchen. You said you'd trick me like you always did. You taught me how people trick each other. I just learned to see it coming." Then the call ended, and I set the phone down and walked out into my own backyard, where the rain was falling soft and steady, and the tomatoes were heavy and red on the vine. Every drama family ends somewhere. Mine ended in a garden. I watered them slowly. I breathed, maybe for the first time in my adult life, all the way down. This story reminds us that love should never be a subscription you keep paying long after the benefits stopped arriving. If you're sitting in your kitchen this morning, wondering why sending that check again still feels like betrayal instead of relief, trust that feeling. Your body usually knows before your heart admits it. Call your bank this week and ask them to show you, in black and white, everything you've sent over the past year. Not to punish anyone, just to see the truth in ink instead of guilt. If a number surprises you, that's information, not shame. Sit down with your paperwork, your will, your accounts, your passwords, the way Serenity did in that little apartment at midnight, and make sure nothing carries your name that you didn't put there yourself. And the next time someone tells you they're struggling, right before mentioning what they need from you, ask one plain question. What did they do with what I already gave? You don't owe anyone your golden years. You spent decades earning them. Spend the ones you have left watering your own garden.